Before there were walls, before the first stone was ever lifted to frame a doorway, the world stretched open in every direction, a vast and borderless landscape where early humans walked not as owners of space, but as participants in it. The earth felt endless, and every horizon seemed to promise both danger and possibility. Wind traveled uninterrupted across plains, brushing against tall grasses that bent like whispering crowds. Light fell freely, shaping no shadows but those cast by bodies moving under the sun. In this world, boundaries did not exist because no human had yet conceived of separating here from there. To live meant to move, and to survive meant to understand a land that answered to no one. Imagine waking each day not within walls, but beneath the sky itself. The ground was the floor, the air the ceiling, and the only shelter was what nature allowed, the overhang of a cave, the curve of a tree trunk, or the warmth of bodies huddled together when night winds grew sharp. Our ancestors lived as all creatures did, woven directly into the fabric of the wilderness. They followed migrating herds across open valleys, crossed rivers without knowing where the water led, and slept wherever exhaustion overcame fear. Life had rhythm but no fixed point. The landscape shaped them, not the other way around. Yet even in this openness, humans were different from other animals. They carried questions inside them, unspoken, forming silently in minds that were beginning to wonder not just how to exist, but why the world existed as it did. They watched birds build nests and sensed, perhaps for the first time, the possibility of crafted space. They saw beavers shape riverbanks, termites craft towering mounds, and felt an instinctive curiosity. But these observations remained seeds, intuitions, not yet innovations. Early humans were still wanderers, still tethered to the world's natural shelters, still unsure of their place in a world too large to claim. There was a beauty in this boundlessness, a kind of freedom modern humans can barely imagine. Every path was open. Every territory was shared. The earth was not divided by fences or ownership, it belonged to no one and everyone. Danger, however, was as constant as the sky overhead. Predators stalked unseen in the grasses, storms arrived with little warning, and the cold could seep into bones with unrelenting cruelty. Shelter was chance, not choice. A cave might offer safety one night but be occupied the next by beasts stronger and more territorial than humans. To survive in such a world, early humans became masters of reading the environment. They could smell approaching rain, hear the distant rhythm of hooves in the earth, and sense the subtle shift in wind that signaled a predator nearby. Their world was not structured but felt, an intuitive web of signs, sounds, and patterns learned over generations. Life was movement, movement was life. A group that stayed too long in one place risked starvation or attack. A group that moved too fast risked leaving behind resources or the elderly. Every decision was a negotiation with nature. In this fluid life, time itself had a different meaning. Without walls, there was no inside to mark safety, and no outside to define threat. The cycle of day and night was the only architecture that shaped their routine. Dawn meant warmth and activity, dusk meant vigilance, and night meant huddling close to the fire, if they were fortunate enough to keep one burning. Firelight created the closest thing they had to an interior, a small circle of warmth where shadows flickered and stories began to form. Here, humanity's earliest sense of shared space emerged, not in physical walls but in emotional ones. The fire created a boundary of light, a fragile line between the known and the unknown. Even so, no structure truly held them. The stars were their ceiling, and the wind was their constant companion. They felt the world as a single, continuous expanse. Boundaries existed only in the territories of beasts or in the cautionary stories told by elders about nearby cliffs, deep ravines, or rival groups wandering far off. Geography shaped behavior, but nothing yet shaped geography. And then came the first subtle shift, not in the environment, but in the human mind. There was a moment, perhaps small and almost invisible to those living through it, when someone realized that space did not have to remain endless. That safety did not have to depend solely on what nature offered. That humans could create the boundaries they needed. But before that realization took form, before the first wall was raised, life remained an open question. This opening section sets the stage for the documentary's exploration by immersing viewers in a world where everything was unbounded, where humanity existed in direct conversation with nature rather than in opposition to it. It invites us to reflect on what it truly meant to live without walls, physically, emotionally, and conceptually. Because to understand the genius of the first wall, we must first understand the world that had none. For early humans, the absence of built boundaries was not merely an environmental condition, it was a psychological one. Without a defined inside, there was no true concept of home. Without an outside, there was no idea of the foreign, the forbidden, or the protected. Everything was simply part of the world, and humans were simply part of everything. The thought that this fluid existence could one day solidify into something permanent would have seemed unimaginable. And yet, buried within these wanderers was the capacity to imagine, to envision shapes before they existed, to alter landscapes with intention rather than instinct. This section closes with the quiet suggestion that the first boundary ever built was not made of stone or wood. It was an idea, fragile, forming slowly, waiting for the moment when a human would dare to draw a line against the vastness, and in doing so, redefine the human experience forever. Long before humans built walls, they built something far more powerful: stories. And stories were born in the glow of firelight. As night pressed against the edges of the world, early humans gathered around flames that crackled like living beings, their light flickering across faces, casting shifting patterns on the earth. Fire became more than warmth, it became a sanctuary for thought. It carved out a circle of safety in a world of darkness, creating the first shared interior, not made of stone or wood, but of light and breath and presence. Within this trembling circle, something remarkable began to stir: imagination. The minds of early humans were changing, evolving, expanding in ways no creature before them had experienced. Fire allowed them to remain awake into the night, a time previously ruled by predators and fear. With the threat of darkness pushed back, even for a little while, space opened for reflection. They looked not only at the world around them, but inward, into memory, into possibility. Stories began as murmurs, gestures, imitations of animals or weather or ancestors, and slowly became narratives. These stories connected moments, lives, and generations. They began to give shape to the world, turning chaos into meaning. Around these fires, humans learned to think in ways that extended beyond immediate survival. They imagined hunts before they happened. They recalled dangerous encounters and turned them into lessons. They speculated about unseen forces, spirits, ancestors, the intentions of animals. In doing so, they sharpened the tools of mental construction, prediction, visualization, abstraction. Imagination became a survival trait as important as any sharpened stone. Every flicker of firelight seemed to awaken new possibilities. Shadows danced on cave walls and humans began to recognize shapes, sometimes accidental, sometimes hinted by nature, and their minds filled in the rest. A smudge might become a bison. A crack might become a running deer. This mental transformation marked a profound step in human evolution, the ability to see not only what is, but what could be. From this ability would one day emerge architecture, art, and entire civilizations. But for now, it was only a spark, quiet, fragile, glowing in the minds of those who sat close to the fire. The fire circle also became the first place where humans contemplated space itself. As they huddled in its glow, pressed shoulder to shoulder, they instinctively formed a boundary between within and without. Outside the firelight lay uncertainty, predators, cold, vastness. Inside lay companionship, warmth, and shared intention. Over time, this simple contrast, the psychological separation of inside versus outside, sowed the earliest seeds of architectural thinking. Humans began to understand that safety could be created, not just found. That a boundary could be imagined before it was built. And in this circle, communication deepened. Gesture became language. Language became story. Story became memory. Through this exchange, humans learned to carry the past forward and project the future inward. They began to plan hunts with deliberate strategy, envisioning outcomes. They learned to construct tools in their minds before shaping them in their hands. This ability to mentally assemble something before physically creating it was the foundation for structural innovation. Every wall, every roof, every planned village in the future would owe its existence to these early fireside thoughts. Children sat close to elders, absorbing their stories like roots drinking in rain. Through tales of danger and triumph, they inherited lessons that shaped identity and behavior. The world became larger and smaller at once, larger because imagination expanded its boundaries, smaller because stories made it feel knowable. Humans became architects not of buildings yet, but of meaning. They shaped the invisible before they shaped the visible. As nights passed and generations changed, firelight conversations grew richer. Ideas began to link together. A human might wonder, if fire can create a safe circle in the dark, could something else create a safe circle in the day? If predators can be kept at bay by flames, could they be kept away by barriers? If the fire defines a center, could a structure define a home? Such questions did not arise suddenly, nor did they form clear answers. Instead, they sat quietly in the evolving mind, waiting until humanity developed the tools and confidence to act upon them. In this section's closing thoughts, we reflect on the profound truth that imagination preceded architecture. Before hands lifted stones, minds lifted possibilities. The glow of fire gave humans not only warmth, but vision, a vision that would one day lead them to reshape the world. The first wall, the first doorway, the first settlement, all were born from nights spent watching flames dance and allowing the mind to wander beyond the limits of the visible world. Imagination became the first construction material, and firelight became its forge. Long before humans dreamed of shaping the world with stone and structure, the world shaped them with unrelenting force. The land itself was a teacher, stern, unpredictable, and often merciless. Early humans lived at the mercy of shifting climates that could change a landscape within a generation. One decade might offer lush valleys where rivers ran thick with fish, where fruits hung heavy on branches, and game grazed in great numbers. The next could bring drought so severe that the earth cracked like broken pottery, or winters so bitter that entire herds vanished. This instability carved resilience into the human spirit and taught early communities that survival was not a right, but a negotiation with nature. The Ice Ages were among the greatest sculptors of human behavior. Vast sheets of ice advanced and retreated like slow-moving giants, reshaping continents and forcing humans to migrate or perish. Cold winds sliced across open plains with a sharpness that could strip warmth from the body in moments. Snow buried familiar landmarks, turning the world into a white maze where direction became guesswork and shelter became a matter of life or death. When storms rose unexpectedly, their roar could drown out the sound of footsteps or the warning growl of a predator. In such moments, early humans felt just how small and fragile they truly were. This was not a world that cared about human effort or intention, it was one that demanded adaptation. Heat brought its own trials. In warm periods, deserts spread like slow-burning fires, swallowing grasslands that had once been abundant. Rivers shrank into narrow ribbons of mud. Waterholes dried, leaving cracked earth patterned like ancient writings. Food became scarce, and groups were forced to travel farther, risking conflict with rival bands over the few remaining resources. Even the nights offered little relief, the air thick and unmoving, carrying the scent of dust and distant lightning. Humans learned to read the smallest signs, a change in the color of clouds, the sudden silence of birds, the faint tremor of thunder, to anticipate survival strategies. The environment shaped not only their bodies but their minds, teaching them to predict, adapt, and innovate. Predators added their own pressures. Packs of wolves hunted with strategy, stalking humans as prey rather than competitors. Big cats watched from the shadows, waiting for moments when humans ventured too far from their groups. In forests, bears or hyenas could appear without warning, tipping the delicate balance between life and death. The land was not empty, it was alive with creatures larger, stronger, and more specialized than humans. Without stable shelter, humans relied on movement, vigilance, and collective protection. Fear became a constant companion, shaping behavior and encouraging the formation of social bonds that increased the odds of survival. These bonds were not built from convenience, they were born from necessity. Yet harshness did not only push humans to endurance, it pushed them toward genius. Every environmental challenge became a lesson. When winds tore through temporary shelters, humans learned to brace structures more firmly or choose locations shielded by natural formations. When caves became overcrowded or contested by animals, humans began to search for alternative solutions, experimenting with new materials and new ideas. Trial and error became a language between people and land, each failure a message, each success a breakthrough. Over time, generations accumulated knowledge not just of how to survive, but how to anticipate the world's moods. Seasons taught humans that change was inevitable. Rainy seasons brought bursts of life, green shoots, flowing rivers, migrations of animals. Dry seasons forced them into scarcity and movement, reminding them that abundance was temporary. Storms taught them humility, showing how powerless a human was against the sky's fury. But in the calm after storms, in the quiet after winter's bite, humans found moments to reflect. These reflections planted new questions. Why must life rely solely on nature's mercy? Could humans create something stable amidst such instability? Could there be a way to tame uncertainty? Over thousands of years, these questions formed the philosophical roots of architecture. Harsh climates did more than threaten survival, they awakened the desire for control. The need for protection transformed into the desire for permanence. The unpredictable world began to feel like a puzzle waiting to be solved, and humans, increasingly aware of their cognitive power, became eager students of the land's lessons. They studied rock formations that resisted storms, trees that bent but did not break, and animal burrows that stayed dry through floods. Nature revealed possibilities, and humans began to imagine how they might imitate and improve upon them. This section closes with a realization: walls were not created simply because humans wanted homes. They were created because the world demanded solutions. Every icy wind, every devouring drought, every roaring predator was a message pointing toward architectural innovation. The land shaped early humans through hardship, and in return, humans began shaping the land through creativity. This uneasy partnership between humanity and environment would eventually give birth to the first built boundary, a defiant answer to a world that had never offered guarantees. Long before walls rose from stone and clay, humans sought refuge in the simplest shapes that nature offered. Shelter, at its earliest stage, was not a structure but a discovery, an overhanging cliff that blocked the rain, a hollow tree trunk that softened the wind, a cave whose darkness felt safer than the open plain at night. These natural formations became the first teachers of architecture, showing humans what protection could feel like. Yet even as they relied on nature's offerings, the instinct to shape their surroundings began to take root. In time, this instinct turned into tentative experimentation, branches bent into arcs, leaves woven into mats, and animal hides draped across frames. None of it was permanent, but it was the beginning of humans learning to build. Picture an early human community preparing for nightfall. The sun dips behind distant hills, and shadows stretch like long fingers across the earth. Families gather, children clinging to their mothers as the temperature drops. A few adults inspect yesterday's windbreak, branches arranged carefully to shield the group from the cold breeze that sweeps across the valley. Some branches have shifted, others have snapped. Repairs are made, simple adjustments born from necessity. The structure is fragile, but its presence matters. It represents the first step toward transforming fear into control. Caves remained valuable, offering a stability early humans could not yet replicate. The stone walls held warmth better than open air, and their enclosed shape muffled the sounds of predators prowling outside. But caves were rarely ideal. Their floors were uneven, their darkness unsettling, and worst of all, they were never truly theirs. Bears, lions, or hyenas often claimed these spaces, forcing humans to approach each potential home with extreme caution. Even when they occupied a cave temporarily, they knew it could be stolen by the next hungry creature that wandered in. Ownership was not yet a concept, protection was temporary, borrowed. This uncertainty pushed humans to experiment further with makeshift shelters. Using fallen branches, they discovered that leaning them together created a cone-like shape that resisted wind. Adding leaves and grasses thickened the walls, blocking out rain. These shelters lacked permanence, often collapsing under heavy weather, but they taught humans something essential: a boundary could be shaped, even if crudely. They were no longer entirely at the mercy of the elements. As knowledge passed between generations, these early structures became more refined. Hide stretched across wooden frames offered insulation, keeping warmth inside during cold nights. Reed walls woven tightly provided shade during scorching seasons. Moss filled gaps, clay sealed joints. Humans learned through trial, error, and observation. They watched how birds weaved twigs into strong nests, how beavers layered sticks to create water-resistant lodges, and how some animals burrowed into earth for safety. With each observation, humans adopted and adapted techniques, blending instinct with imitation. These shelters also transformed social life. Sleeping together beneath a constructed roof brought a sense of community and closeness. Families gathered inside these structures during storms, whispering stories or simply listening to the drumming rain. Children grew up believing that humans could make safety with their own hands, a stark contrast to the generation before them. Though the shelters were fragile, they provided the psychological comfort of inside, a concept that would one day become central to human identity. In these early experiments, the seeds of architecture began to germinate. The human mind learned to think in terms of shape, support, and stability. If a branch bent too easily, it needed reinforcement. If a hide sagged, it needed tighter stretching. If the wind found its way through, more layers were added. These adjustments may seem minor now, but in the arc of human evolution, they represented monumental leaps in cognition and creativity. The idea of modifying the environment, rather than simply enduring it, took hold more deeply with each attempt. These structures also marked the beginning of planned space. Camps grew more organized as shelters were placed intentionally, forming loose circles around fire pits or clustered along the safest parts of terrain. Space became meaningful. Areas were set aside for toolmaking, sleeping, cooking, and gathering. Humans began shaping not just individual shelters, but the layout of their living areas. The land became a canvas, and shelters were the first brushstrokes. Yet, despite these advancements, early shelters were still temporary, still portable, still rooted in the nomadic rhythm of life. Groups dismantled them when food sources moved or seasons changed. They left behind faint traces, flattened grass, scattered twigs, a ring of ashes, nothing permanent enough to outlast their presence. These were shelters meant for movement, not for settling, reflections of a world where survival depended on flexibility. But the lessons learned from these simple structures accumulated quietly. Each generation refined its techniques, each innovation bringing humans one step closer to permanence. When the time finally came to build lasting walls, walls that stayed even when their builders moved on, humanity would draw from the long, humble history of leaning branches, stretched hides, and shallow burrows. This section closes on the truth that the first shelters were not grand, not monumental, and not meant to endure. They were acts of curiosity and courage, small rebellions against a world that offered little safety. They taught humans that the environment was not just something to survive within, but something that could be shaped in return. And in that realization lay the future, one where walls would rise from the earth and change the course of human existence forever. Across the ancient landscapes where early humans once walked, traces of their earliest construction still lie hidden, faint, weathered, and humble, yet deeply revealing. These remnants are not towering monuments or pristine structures. They are scattered stones in circular patterns, post holes sunk into the earth like old scars, and oddly arranged debris that hints at intention. Time has softened their edges, blurred their outlines, and swallowed their stories, but archaeology brings them back into focus. When we kneel beside these fragments, brushing away soil and centuries, we begin to witness the earliest attempts humanity made to shape space for its own needs. These first built forms were not elaborate, yet they carry the profound weight of origin. Imagine standing where an early settlement once existed, now nothing more than a gentle rise in the landscape. To the untrained eye, the ground seems ordinary, just another patch of earth. But a closer look reveals stones arranged deliberately, forming the ghost of a circular boundary. Perhaps they once supported a frame of branches or held down animal hide stretched taut against wind. Perhaps they marked a communal gathering area, a storage pit, or a spiritual enclosure. Whatever their purpose, the stones remain as silent witnesses to the ingenuity of hands long gone. They remind us that human architecture began not with giant structures, but with small decisions, choices layered over time until they shaped civilizations. Archaeologists often speak of post holes, darkened patches in the soil where wooden poles once stood. Wood decays, but the earth remembers. It retains the outline of where posts were driven deep to support walls or roofs. These post holes often form patterns, repeated arcs, parallel lines, even intricate clusters suggesting different sections of a single structure. From these, researchers reconstruct the shapes of ancient dwellings, imagining how early humans might have entered, slept, cooked, or gathered. These impressions in the earth act like fingerprints of forgotten ideas. They show us that long before stone houses or fortified cities, humans experimented with framework, geometry, and layout. Some of the earliest stone arrangements reveal something even more intriguing: intention beyond survival. Certain circles of stones appear to have held no roof or shelter at all. Instead, they may have been ritual or communal spaces, areas defined not for living, but for meaning. A few archaeologists believe these might represent humanity's first rooms, without walls, symbolic enclosures that shaped behavior rather than weather. Such discoveries blur the line between practicality and imagination. They show that the earliest architecture was not only about protection, it was also about identity, gathering, and the beginnings of cultural expression. Not far from these simple stone rings, tools and debris tell additional stories. Scraps of worked flint suggest that certain areas were designated for toolmaking. Clusters of charred bones imply cooking sites or communal feasts. A concentration of shells or pigments hints at artistic or symbolic activities. These spatial patterns reveal early humans beginning to divide their environment into functional zones, areas for crafting, eating, resting, or ceremony. Even without standing walls, humans were already shaping the layout of their lives, using the earth itself as a blueprint. The earliest built forms therefore include not just structures, but the organization of space. Wind and rain have long eroded these early creations, but they have not erased them entirely. In some regions, archaeologists find stones worn smooth by centuries of weather, still arranged in ways that clearly indicate human placement. In others, collapsed fragments of ancient hearths or pits remain exactly where they were left thousands of years ago. The land has preserved these memories, offering them to those willing to look closely. Each discovery, no matter how small, deepens our understanding of the moment when humans first began to impose patterns onto the natural world. One of the most fascinating aspects of these sites is how modest they are. There is no grandeur, no monumental ambition, no intent to impress. And yet their significance is monumental. These structures represent the earliest sparks of architectural thinking, the transition from simply using nature to consciously altering it. Each moved stone, each dug post hole, signals a moment when a human made a decision shaped by foresight rather than instinct. These decisions accumulated over generations, forming the foundation for increasingly complex construction. In this sense, these early traces are less ruins and more beginnings. As we study these remnants, we can almost imagine the people who placed them. A family deciding where to sleep based on wind patterns. A group of hunters arranging stones to tether animal skins for drying. A small community outlining a space for gathering during colder months. We imagine hands, rough, calloused, determined, lifting stones, pressing them firmly into the dirt, aligning them with care. These actions, though simple, were acts of human will imposed on an indifferent landscape. They marked the first steps toward permanence. This section closes with the idea that these stones, these faint impressions in soil, are more than archaeological evidence, they are memory carved into the earth. They whisper of a time when humanity's architectural journey was just beginning, when a single stone moved with purpose marked a boundary between wilderness and intention. These earliest built forms, fragile yet enduring, remind us that architecture is not defined by size or grandeur, but by the decision to shape the world rather than simply inhabit it. The stones that remain are the world's way of remembering that moment, when humans first dared to build. For countless generations, early humans lived in a world defined by motion. They followed the migrations of animals, the sprouting of seasonal plants, and the shifting moods of weather. To stay in one place for too long was to risk starvation, danger, or the collapse of social bonds shaped by shared movement. Yet something subtle began to change as knowledge deepened, as humans learned not only to find resources but to anticipate them. Gradually, the world's unpredictability grew familiar enough that some groups dared to linger. This moment, when movement slowed, when wandering became waiting, marked one of the most significant turning points in human history. Imagine a group arriving at a river valley rich with fish, edible roots, and sheltered terrain. They have passed through this area many times before, but now the valley feels different. Instead of treating it as a waypoint, they remain for an extra day. Then another. The children play longer, the elders feel safer, the hunters notice that game passes nearby repeatedly. Slowly, a question settles into their collective mind: why leave? The thought is fragile at first, almost forbidden. The instinct to move is deeply ingrained, a lesson tied to survival itself. But as the group becomes familiar with the valley's rhythm, the idea of staying begins to feel less like risk and more like opportunity. This shift was not sudden. It unfolded across many regions and countless generations. Early humans realized that some landscapes did not just offer temporary abundance, they held reliable patterns. Rivers flooded in predictable seasons, soil renewed itself, and animals returned at the same time each year. These recurring cycles gave birth to a new idea: permanence. Where once humans saw danger in staying still, they now saw potential. But embracing this potential meant confronting an internal conflict. Movement had been freedom. It had been identity. To settle meant redefining not just behavior, but the very meaning of home. As groups lingered longer, their temporary shelters became more elaborate. A structure built for a single cold night now needed to withstand weeks of weather. Repairs became reinforcements. Makeshift camps began to show signs of durability. People began leaving markers, stones, tools, even carved symbols, to identify returning spots. These small acts signaled the first steps toward belonging, a concept foreign to their nomadic past. The landscape, once something they passed through, slowly became something they might claim. With settlement came new responsibilities. Remaining in one place meant learning to manage resources rather than simply find them. Humans observed that areas could be overharvested, that firewood needed to be collected thoughtfully, that waste attracted predators. These realizations encouraged cooperation and communication at deeper levels. Decisions could no longer be made only for the moment, they needed to account for seasons, for future hunts, for the well-being of children who would grow up here rather than along a wandering path. Planning extended beyond days into months. A new form of thinking emerged: one rooted not in movement, but in time. Emotionally, the shift was profound. For the first time, humans experienced what it meant to return to the same place and recognize it. A familiar tree might mark where a child had taken their first steps. A river bend might hold the memory of a successful hunt or the laughter of shared meals. The land began to feel like a companion, not just a backdrop. Memory accumulated in specific locations, binding people not only to each other but to the environment itself. A sense of place grew where before there had been only passing landscapes. But settling also introduced vulnerability. Staying still meant becoming part of the territory, visible to rivals, predictable to predators, and exposed to environmental changes. A drought could devastate a settled group more quickly than a mobile one. A surprise attack could be catastrophic. These risks forced humans to rethink protection in ways nomadic life never required. They needed stronger, more permanent boundaries. They needed walls. Not just as shelters, but as declarations of presence. As the desire for safety grew, so did the vision of shaping the land more intentionally. Settlement and architecture became intertwined, each pushing the other forward. In this turning point between old and new ways of living, humans stood at a crossroads of identity. They were no longer purely wanderers, yet not fully settlers. They were experimenting with a future that required new skills, new structures, and new forms of cooperation. They were learning that stability demanded effort, not just physically, but socially and emotionally. Staying still required as much courage as moving on. This section ends with the realization that the birth of settlement was not a single act but a gradual awakening. It was the moment humanity began imagining a life where safety, memory, and community could take root in the same soil. And once this idea took hold, the stage was set for the next great leap, the building of true walls, structures meant not just to shelter a night, but to endure lifetimes. The world would never be the same again. Before the first true wall rose from the earth, there must have been a moment when one human, just one, saw possibility where others saw only habit. This individual was not necessarily stronger or more skilled than their companions, but something in their mind worked differently. While the group moved through landscapes with practiced familiarity, this person lingered. While others built simple shelters from instinct, they questioned how those shelters might endure longer, stand firmer, protect more deeply. This section imagined such a figure, not as a mythical hero, but as a reflection of countless innovators who, scattered across time and space, made the same quiet leap of imagination that changed humanity forever. Picture this early architect as they sit near the edge of the group's encampment, observing the wind's behavior. They notice how gusts slip through gaps in crude shelters. They see how the loose branches bend and sway under pressure. They pay attention to how stones remain unmoved even when storms lash the valley. Perhaps an earlier shelter collapsed unexpectedly, leaving the group exposed during a harsh night. Perhaps they watched a child shiver from cold that might have been prevented. The spark of innovation often ignites not from ambition, but from empathy or frustration. And so this mind begins to wonder, what if a wall could be stronger? What if a boundary could last? While others prepare for the next migration, the architect hesitates. Their gaze lingers on the shape of the land, the curve of a hill, the arrangement of stones scattered by nature. They begin to see patterns, places where wind breaks naturally, where soil remains dry after rain, where fallen branches form partial enclosures. These observations grow into ideas, ideas into experiments. They test how stones stack, how branches interlock, how mud binds when dried by the sun. At first, others may find this strange or unnecessary. Why invest effort in something that cannot be carried, something that ties them to one place? But innovation rarely begins with consensus, it begins with a single mind refusing to accept limitation. The early architect's failures are many. A wall collapses under its own weight. A structure meant to shield fire instead traps smoke. A support beam snaps during a storm, leaving part of the shelter unusable. Each failure invites frustration, but also learning. They adjust angles, change materials, consult elders who have knowledge of certain trees or soils. Slowly, their hands grow skilled, not only in constructing but in understanding. They realize that building is not just stacking materials, it is listening to them. How does this stone want to sit? How does this branch want to bend? How does the earth support weight? Architecture, even in its earliest form, is a conversation. Others in the group begin to notice the results. A windbreak that once failed now stands firm. A shelter reinforced with carefully selected stones remains upright after a storm that leveled others. Children sleep more comfortably in the enclosure crafted by this visionary. These small successes shift the community's perception. What once seemed eccentric now seems useful, perhaps even wise. Slowly, the architect gains both respect and followers. Not through authority, but through demonstration. In a world where survival was fragile, any improvement, even a small one, resonated deeply. The architect's vision continues to grow. They begin thinking not just about protection but about space itself. How can a structure create warmth? How can a boundary foster cooperation? How can a shelter be built so that repairing one part doesn't require rebuilding the whole? These questions mark the birth of systematic thinking, the essence of architecture. The mind behind these ideas begins sketching invisible lines in the dirt, measuring with footsteps, imagining shapes before they take form. This is the dawn of intentional design. But innovation rarely comes without resistance. Some members of the group worry that building stronger structures encourages settling in one place, which they fear could attract predators or rival bands. Others believe effort should focus on hunting and gathering, not on shaping the land. Even so, progress continues because the architect understands something the others have not yet realized, that humans can transform their environment in ways that enhance not only survival but identity. In the quiet moments, perhaps during late nights by the fire or early mornings when dew coats the grass, the architect reflects on the meaning of building. What does it change within a community when a wall stands between them and the wild? How does it redefine fear, hope, or belonging? These reflections deepen their resolve. The first wall, in their mind, is not just a structure, it is a statement that humans are no longer completely subject to nature's whims. It is a claim to agency. Eventually, the architect completes a structure unlike any seen before, a wall that stands through storms, a shelter spacious enough for multiple families, or perhaps an enclosure that protects food from animals. Its form is simple, but its impact is profound. For the first time, the group sees that a boundary crafted by human hands can remain even when they leave. It becomes a marker of identity, a sign that they have shaped a piece of the world in their own image. This section concludes with the recognition that throughout history, such architects have appeared at moments of transition. They are the ones who look at the world not as it is, but as it might become. Their contributions may be small at first, barely more than a shift in perspective, but they ripple outward across generations. The first architect of the dawn symbolizes the courage of imagination, the birth of intentional creation, and the spark that would one day give rise to architecture, cities, and civilizations. Before architecture became a discipline of grand visions and monumental stone, it began with the humblest elements, materials found underfoot, gathered from riverbanks, pried from the skeletons of hunted animals, or shaped by fire. These early builders had no blueprints, no inherited craft, no examples to follow. What they did have was curiosity, resourcefulness, and a growing awareness that the natural world offered more than survival, it offered tools for creation. Mud, bone, and fire were not merely objects, they were catalysts for a new era of human invention. And their discovery as building materials marked the moment when architecture shifted from instinct to intention. Mud was often the first revelation. It clung to hands, filled footprints, and dried into hardened crusts that resisted wind and rain. Early humans noticed how mud transformed from soft to solid as the sun moved overhead. They began experimenting, packing it into gaps between branches, smearing it over frameworks of reeds, shaping small lumps to test how they cracked or crumbled. At first, these trials were simple, almost childlike. But soon mud became a trusted material, one that could seal a shelter, reinforce walls, or insulate against cold. The earth itself became pliable under human hands, offering a sense of control in a world where little else was predictable. Bones, meanwhile, offered surprising strength. After a successful hunt, nothing went to waste. Bones became tools, weapons, and eventually structural supports. Long leg bones of large animals served as sturdy posts, ribs formed natural arches, shoulder blades worked as shovels for digging foundations. The idea that a creature's remains could support human life even after death carried spiritual resonance. These bones were reminders of the tight relationship between survival and innovation, a relationship built on respect, necessity, and ingenuity. Using bones in construction reflected a growing understanding of how shapes work together, how weight can be distributed, and how nature's designs could be repurposed with intention. Reeds and grasses added flexibility. They were light, plentiful, and easy to weave into mats, ropes, or walls. By binding bundles of reeds together, early builders created panels that could be rolled, lifted, or shaped into curves. These materials taught humans about craftsmanship, not just stacking or piling, but weaving, tying, and layering. Reeds whispered the first lessons in tensile strength, in the art of creating surfaces that bend without breaking. They also introduced the idea of modularity, pieces that could be assembled, disassembled, and rearranged as needed. For nomadic groups, this adaptability was invaluable. Then came fire, both a threat and an ally. Humans already depended on fire for warmth and cooking, but they began to notice how heat transformed certain materials. Clay hardened when placed near flames. Wood became more resilient when lightly charred, resisting rot and insects. Animal hides stiffened and tightened when dried by heat, making them better suited as coverings or windbreaks. Fire revealed a new dimension, transformation. Materials were no longer used in their natural state alone, they could be altered, improved, and strengthened. Fire was humanity's first true collaborator, unlocking potentials otherwise hidden. Together, these materials created new possibilities. A shelter reinforced with mud became warmer. A frame built with bones could withstand stronger winds. A wall woven from reeds kept sand at bay. These early successes encouraged more experimentation. Humans began to recognize that the environment offered a palette, and they were learning how to paint with it. Trial and error shaped technique. Clay that cracked too quickly was mixed with grass. Bones that snapped under pressure were replaced with thicker ones. Mud that washed away in rain was combined with ash or sand. Every improvement was a step toward mastery. Working with these materials also brought communities closer. Construction required cooperation, one person gathering reeds, another mixing mud, another positioning stones or bones. These collective efforts strengthened social bonds, teaching humans that shared labor created shared protection. A shelter built together was not simply a structure, it was a symbol of belonging. Around these shelters, life became more stable, more predictable, more secure. And with stability came time to think, invent, and imagine further advancements. As humans shaped mud and bone, the materials shaped them in return. They learned patience from waiting for mud to dry. They learned precision from fitting bones together. They learned respect for nature's offerings, understanding that each material had its own personality, its strengths, limitations, and ideal uses. This growing relationship between human intention and material reality laid the foundation for all architecture to come. A wall was no longer just a barrier, it was a collaboration between human vision and the natural world. This section closes with a simple truth: the first materials of architecture were not grand or imposing. They were ordinary substances transformed by extraordinary insight. Mud offered form, bone offered strength, reeds offered flexibility, and fire offered transformation. Together, they became the building blocks of early human ingenuity. What began as survival soon became creativity. And from creativity emerged the first true sense of what humans could build, not just shelters, but possibilities. Long before walls became symbols of cities or fortresses, they emerged quietly as tools that reshaped the social fabric of early human life. A simple line drawn with stones, branches, or hardened mud began to change how people interacted with each other and with their environment. The first walls were not built for grandeur, they were built for clarity. They defined where a family slept, where food was stored, where tools were kept, and where strangers were expected to stop. These boundaries, modest as they were, introduced a new form of technology, the organization of human behavior through space itself. Imagine a small settlement at dusk. Smoke from cooking fires drifts upward, children's laughter echoes faintly, and hunters return from the plains with fresh meat. In this moment of daily rhythm, a particular structure stands out, a low wall encircling a cluster of sleeping spaces. It is not tall enough to keep out predators, but it marks something crucial, an inside. Within this boundary lies safety, belonging, and familiarity. Outside lies the unpredictable expanse of wilderness. The wall does not function as a physical defense as much as a psychological one, teaching the community that space can be shaped with intention to reflect identity and order. Once early humans understood that a boundary could shape movement, they began using walls to influence how people behaved. A wall around a food storage area reduced conflict by making clear who could access it and when. A small enclosure for toolmaking kept children away from sharp objects and maintained order during busy working hours. The moment space was structured, roles and responsibilities became clearer. Walls did not just separate, they organized. They defined who belonged where and fostered new forms of coordination, cooperation, and social structure. These boundaries also introduced the idea of privacy. In purely nomadic life, privacy barely existed. Families slept close, worked close, and traveled close. But once walls entered the picture, even in their simplest forms, humans began carving out spaces not just for groups, but for individuals. A small walled corner might be where someone slept alone, where a mother tended to her child, or where a craftsman hid precious tools. For the first time, humans experienced the feeling of being alone, but safe. This new emotional landscape, this ability to step away from others without stepping into danger, was a profound psychological shift. Yet walls also sparked tension. As soon as some spaces were marked as inside, others became outside. And outside often meant exclusion. Some individuals or neighboring groups might approach a settlement and find themselves unwelcome beyond certain points. The wall that symbolized security for one group symbolized rejection to another. This dual nature of boundaries, protective yet divisive, became an inherent paradox in human society. From the beginning, walls carried the weight of both connection and separation. Still, the benefits often outweighed the drawbacks. Boundaries allowed communities to grow more complex. Different sections of a settlement began to serve different purposes. Sleeping areas clustered together, creating quieter zones. Work areas were placed near natural light. Food storage walls faced away from heat. Even without architectural theory, humans intuitively learned to shape their surroundings to enhance efficiency and comfort. The settlement became an organism of interconnected parts, each serving a function defined by physical boundaries. Over time, walls became symbols, not just of space, but of ideas. A well-maintained wall represented responsibility and care. A shared wall between families represented trust and cooperation. A boundary around sacred spaces represented reverence. People assigned meaning to structures, and these meanings influenced behavior and belief. Instead of relying solely on spoken rules, communities began communicating through architecture. The placement of walls guided footsteps, rituals, and daily routines. Space itself became a language. Even conflict was transformed by walls. In the past, disputes over resources or sleeping arrangements could escalate unpredictably. With boundaries in place, there were clear limits, clear expectations. Arguments shifted from spontaneous physical clashes to discussions about access, fairness, and negotiation. In this way, walls contributed to the development of social norms, shared understandings that stabilized communities. What began as a simple physical barrier evolved into a social contract. The early builders likely did not realize the magnitude of what they were creating. To them, a wall was a practical solution to a practical problem. But we, looking back, can see that these early boundaries rippled outward through time, influencing the very foundations of human civilization. They allowed populations to grow, crafts to specialize, leadership to emerge, and culture to flourish. They taught humans that space could be shaped to reflect, and reinforce, social values. This section concludes by emphasizing that walls were never just barriers. They were tools of thought, of communication, of community. They organized the rhythms of daily life and laid the groundwork for every structured society that followed. The first walls did not merely protect humans, they reshaped how humans related to one another. They were, in essence, the earliest form of social technology, a quiet revolution in how humanity understood itself and its place in the world. The emergence of permanent walls and defined spaces set the stage for something even more transformative, the birth of the first true villages. What began as loosely arranged clusters of temporary shelters gradually evolved into intentional settlements, places where lives intertwined, memories accumulated, and identity took root. A village was more than a gathering of dwellings, it was a new kind of human organism, pulsing with shared rhythms, shaped by cooperation, and held together by invisible bonds of trust. For the first time in human history, people were not just surviving together, they were living together. Imagine a settlement at sunrise. Smoke rises from hearths that have burned through the night, warming families who slept within walls they built themselves. Dogs stretch and yawn near doorways, already bonded with the humans who feed them. The air carries the soft sounds of stirring people, pottery being moved, reeds rustling as entrances are opened, quiet voices exchanging greetings. The village feels alive long before the sun fully illuminates the landscape. Unlike nomadic camps that dissolve with the dawn, this place remains, its structures holding stories from the previous day and waiting for more. The placement of these early homes was not random. Over time, humans learned to organize them around central areas, open spaces where people gathered, food was shared, decisions were made, and tools were crafted. This centrality marked an important shift, the community itself had become the heart of daily life. Children played within this safe middle ground, watched by elders whose wisdom guided every generation. Hunters prepared for journeys while farmers and gatherers traded knowledge about edible plants or approaching weather. Life took on a pattern that repeated and evolved, giving rise to culture. With shared space came shared responsibility. Water sources had to be protected, food stored carefully, fires tended so they didn't spread to neighboring homes. The village required cooperation to function. Individuals could no longer make decisions solely for themselves, every choice affected the entire community. This interdependence strengthened bonds. When someone built a new wall, others helped. When a family repaired their roof, neighbors joined them. Survival became a collective effort rather than a solitary struggle. These early villages were filled with sensory richness. Paths wore into the earth from countless footsteps. Cooking smells drifted through the air at predictable times each day. The walls of homes bore marks, fingerprints in drying mud, decorative impressions of woven grass, smoothed surfaces where hands leaned over generations. Tools were passed from parent to child, along with techniques refined over centuries of trial and error. Each household was unique, yet all shared the same underlying architectural logic, a commitment to place. Inside these homes, life grew increasingly structured. Families created distinct areas for sleeping, cooking, working, and storing food. Furniture of sorts began to appear, flat stones used as tables, pits dug for grain storage, raised platforms for sleeping. The interior of a home became an extension of identity, reflecting values, habits, and aspirations. As homes became more refined, so did the idea of permanence. People began to imagine not just living in a place, but belonging to it. They saw the future unfolding in the same space where their ancestors had lived. But permanence also brought challenges. A village could no longer simply move when resources dwindled. People had to manage the land carefully, rotating fields, maintaining water supplies, and defending their settlement from animals or rival groups. These responsibilities encouraged innovation. New tools were developed, storage methods improved, and building techniques refined. Walls became thicker, roofs stronger, floors smoother. The village transformed continually as each generation added its own knowledge. The emergence of communal identity was perhaps the most profound shift. In nomadic groups, identity flowed with movement. But in settled villages, identity was tied to place. People spoke of our village, our land, our home. They buried their dead nearby, planting the roots of ancestry in the soil. Rituals developed, ceremonies around fire, storytelling traditions, shared celebrations of harvest or successful hunts. The village became a living story, carried not only in memories but in the very structures built by human hands. Trade also began to flourish. When neighboring villages emerged, people exchanged tools, materials, and ideas. A new kind of relationship grew between communities, one based not solely on competition but on cooperation and shared advancement. Knowledge traveled across landscapes with traders and wanderers, inspiring new building techniques and cultural practices. Architecture became a shared human language. This section concludes with the realization that villages were not simply larger camps, they were the first experiments in civilization. They marked humanity's transition from wandering beings shaped by nature to community-centered creators shaping the world around them. In the birth of the village, we witnessed the moment humans stepped into a new chapter, one where they no longer just lived on the land, but lived with it, within it, and, increasingly, because of it. The shift from wandering hunter-gatherers to settled agricultural communities was not just an economic transformation, it was an architectural revolution. Once humans learned to coax plants from the soil and predict their growth, everything changed. Hunting could bring feast or famine, but crops brought possibility, stability, and long-term planning. Fields of grain needed protection. Harvests needed storage. Tools needed safekeeping. Families needed permanent shelter near the fields they tended. Agriculture did not simply allow humans to settle, it demanded that they build. Imagine a freshly cultivated field at dawn, mist curling over young shoots of barley or wheat. A family stands at its edge, hopeful but anxious. For the first time, their survival depends not on the chase but on the patience of growing seasons. They cannot follow herds anymore, they must remain. This permanence reveals new vulnerabilities. Animals might trample their crops. Thieves, whether rival groups or simply desperate wanderers, might steal grain. Weather could destroy months of labor in a single night. The answer to all these fears was architecture, boundaries, storage structures, and shelters strong enough to anchor a new way of life. The earliest farmers quickly realized that harvested grain needed protection from moisture, pests, and decay. They began building raised storage pits, mud-lined or stone-lined cavities covered with wooden lids. Over time, these pits evolved into above-ground granaries supported by posts, lifted high enough to deter rodents and insulated with mud plaster. These granaries became the beating heart of early farming villages. A full granary meant survival through winter, an empty one meant hunger, migration, or death. The architecture of storage was as important as the architecture of shelter. This new emphasis on resource protection transformed how people thought about space. A home was no longer just a place to sleep, it was a place to guard the fruits of labor. Walls grew thicker, roofs sturdier, entrances more secure. Families carved out corners of their homes specifically for storing tools, grinding grain, or drying seeds. The domestic environment became more complex, more organized. Rooms, divisions, and boundaries emerged not from aesthetic desire but from agricultural necessity. Farming also reshaped the landscape itself. Irrigation channels carved through the earth became some of humanity's earliest engineered systems, guided streams that delivered life to crops. These channels required both planning and maintenance. Villagers constructed small barriers to direct water flow, using stones, mud, or bundled reeds. These were walls in their own right, serving not to separate people but to command nature. With each season, irrigation became more refined. Humans were learning to sculpt land with intention, extending architectural thinking beyond the home and into the greater environment. As agriculture expanded, so did the need for cooperation. A single family could tend a field, but the entire community needed to protect it. Early villages built perimeter walls or simple fences of woven branches to mark cultivated areas. These boundaries signaled ownership, an entirely new social concept. Before agriculture, no group could claim a piece of land permanently because movement was constant. Now, land had value. Effort had value. Investment had value. And architecture became the physical expression of that investment. Of course, agriculture did not immediately erase hunger. There were failed harvests, unpredictable weather patterns, pests, and disease. But these hardships strengthened the importance of architecture even more. When crops failed, storage systems became lifelines. When rains overwhelmed fields, raised structures preserved seeds for the next planting. When predators threatened livestock, the first domesticated companions of farming communities, fenced enclosures defended against loss. Each challenge sharpened innovation. With stability came growth. Families had more children because food supply became steadier. Population increased, and with it the pressure to expand settlements. Houses multiplied, granaries became communal structures, and central gathering spaces grew larger to accommodate more people. This architectural expansion paralleled social complexity, leadership roles formed, conflict resolution systems emerged, and traditions surrounding planting and harvest became embedded in daily life. Emotionally, agriculture introduced new forms of hope and fear. For the first time, humans could imagine the future months ahead with some clarity. They watched seeds sprout, grow, and ripen. Their relationship with time changed, no longer dictated solely by migration patterns, but by planting seasons, harvests, and weather cycles. Architecture reflected this temporal awareness. Homes were built to last. Walls were constructed to endure more than a single season. Villages were arranged not for temporary survival, but for continuity. This section closes with an understanding that agriculture and architecture are inseparable. Farming required humans to stay, and staying required humans to build. The earliest walls of permanent settlements were responses to hunger as much as to hope, acts of faith in a future that could be shaped, protected, and prepared for. In learning to grow food, humanity learned to grow roots. And those roots would anchor every architectural achievement to come. As early human settlements grew and daily survival became less uncertain, something remarkable began to happen. People started building not only for protection or storage, but for meaning. The same hands that shaped shelters and granaries began shaping spaces for the unseen, for ancestors, for spirits, for the forces of nature they felt but could not name. Architecture crossed an invisible threshold. It became symbolic. Walls were no longer only practical boundaries, they became sacred enclosures that held ritual, memory, and belief. Imagine a gathering at twilight, the sky fading into deep purples and soft golds. Villagers light torches and walk toward a circular stone formation at the edge of their settlement. This structure is unlike their homes, larger, smoother, arranged with an intentional symmetry that feels ceremonial. The space within the circle is swept clean. Offerings of seeds, carved bones, or painted stones rest at its center. People step inside not to sleep or work, but to connect with each other, with mysteries they cannot put into words, with the echoes of their ancestors. These are beginnings of sacred architecture. Long before temples rose from carved stone, early humans delineated sacred spaces with simple walls or stone rings. These boundaries created a distinct sense of inside the ritual versus outside the ordinary. Even a low wall, no taller than a knee, could mark a profound shift in experience. Inside, voices softened, movements slowed, and attention focused. The wall did not need to restrict entry physically, it shaped behavior psychologically. It signaled that what happened within had significance beyond daily life. Why did early humans build such spaces? Partly because they were learning to interpret the world not just through necessity, but through wonder. They saw patterns in the stars, seasons in the wind, life in the soil. They felt gratitude for rain, fear of storms, awe before the birth of a child. As imagination deepened and social bonds grew, they needed places to hold these emotions collectively. A sacred enclosure became a container for intangible feelings, grief, hope, reverence, celebration. The boundary made these emotions visible, shared, and ritualized. Some enclosures marked burial grounds. Others were used for rites of passage. Some may have been astronomical markers, aligning with solstices or moon cycles long before written calendars existed. Archaeological sites like Göbekli Tepe reveal that ritual architecture even preceded agriculture in some regions, suggesting that spirituality itself may have driven people to gather and build. These sacred walls were humanity's first attempt to give physical form to belief. Material choices took on symbolic meaning. Stones selected for sacred enclosures were often smoother, larger, or arranged with greater attention than those used for ordinary shelters. The effort invested signaled respect. Bones placed within walls might belong to revered animals or ancestors. Mud mixed with pigment or ash could mark ceremonial pathways. Even the placement of entrances, facing sunrise, a mountain, or a river, expressed cosmology. Through these decisions, architecture became a language of the sacred. Ritual practice inside these enclosures also influenced community structure. Certain individuals, shamans, elders, storytellers, became guardians of tradition, guiding ceremonies that shaped identity. The walls amplified their presence, focusing attention, creating acoustics, framing movement. Inside these spaces, stories of beginnings and spirits were told, chants echoed, and fires cast shadows that seemed alive. Children grew up associating these forms with mystery and belonging. Sacred enclosures became emotional anchors in a rapidly changing world. These spaces also strengthened social cohesion. Rituals brought people together during major transitions, harvests, droughts, births, deaths. The physical boundary created a sense of equality. Once inside, everyone shared a common purpose. Differences of role or status softened in the presence of collective meaning. The act of building these enclosures itself required cooperation, deepening bonds among villagers. By shaping sacred space, humans shaped community identity. At the same time, sacred walls created separation, not only between sacred and mundane, but between groups. Different communities developed unique forms of ritual architecture, which reflected their beliefs and distinguished them from others. Identity became tied to structure. One village might build stone circles, another might construct wooden poles adorned with symbols. These differences sowed the early seeds of cultural diversity. As architecture evolved, these sacred enclosures foreshadowed future monuments. The logic behind them, symmetry, orientation, layered meaning, would eventually give rise to temples, tombs, pyramids, and ceremonial centers. But at this early stage, their power came not from scale, but from intention. They represented humanity's first step toward constructing spaces not just for shelter, but for the soul. This section concludes by revealing an essential truth: architecture did not originate solely from hunger or fear, but also from reverence. Humans built walls to protect their bodies, yes, but they also built walls to hold their beliefs. In these sacred enclosures, we witness the moment when construction became culture, when space became symbolic, and when architecture began to reflect the inner landscape of the human spirit. For most of human prehistory, life unfolded in the open, under the sky, around communal fires, in shared shelters where every emotion, every conversation, every moment was visible to others. Privacy, as we know it today, simply did not exist. Yet as walls became more defined and settlements grew more structured, a quiet revolution began inside the human mind. A simple act, stepping into a walled space, closing an entrance of woven reeds or a hide flap, changed the psychological landscape forever. For the first time, a human could be alone by choice, and this solitude sparked the birth of something profound, the sense of self as separate from the group. Imagine a small home in an early village. The interior is simple, packed earth floor, a hearth smoldering quietly, a low wall dividing sleeping and working spaces. Light filters through cracks in the roof, illuminating dust motes drifting slowly in the warm air. A young woman enters after a long day of gathering plants. With a practiced motion, she pulls a hide across the entrance, muffling the sounds of the bustling village outside. For a moment, everything quiets. The boundaries of the world shrink. The noise of life becomes distant. Inside this pause, wrapped by walls she helped build, she hears not the voices of others, but her own. This experience, mundane to us, was revolutionary then. Privacy created a new mental space where thought could deepen. In communal living, emotions spread quickly, fear, excitement, frustration. But inside a room, feelings could be processed without external influence. People began internalizing ideas, reflecting on memories, shaping opinions independent of the group. The concept of my thoughts emerged, distinct from our thoughts. Architecture had unintentionally unlocked individuality. Privacy also transformed relationships. A couple could step away from the group to resolve conflict or share intimacy. Parents could soothe a child without an audience, or elders could instruct younger members in quiet moments. These private interactions strengthened bonds in ways that public interactions never could. The home became a container not just for bodies, but for emotions. Walls held conversations too delicate for the open air. The simple sound of a door covering an entrance, whether a wooden plank, a hide, or a woven mat, signaled the beginning of private life. With privacy came secrets. Humans learned to keep certain thoughts hidden, certain objects tucked away, certain dreams whispered only in solitude. Secrets were not always negative, they were a natural extension of individuality. The internal world expanded. People began envisioning futures that differed from the expectations of the group. They imagined personal goals, crafted hidden tokens of affection, or pursued creative ideas quietly before revealing them. Innovation often begins in private, and early architecture provided the first space where such innovation could take root. Children growing up in these more structured homes experienced the shift instinctively. They learned that some corners of the home were their own, places to play, to think, to dream. Even a small alcove or raised platform offered a sense of personal domain. The concept of mine emerged not only in terms of objects, but in terms of space. This subtle psychological change reshaped how future generations viewed identity, property, and autonomy. Privacy also altered social dynamics within villages. With defined homes and personal spaces, people interacted in more nuanced ways. Visiting someone's dwelling became a gesture of trust or respect. Entering without permission could cause conflict. Invitations to step inside held meaning. The boundary of the home became sacred, a place where the rules of the outside world softened or shifted. The control humans gained over their personal environment granted them new forms of power, the power to welcome, the power to refuse, the power to retreat. As architectural forms evolved, doors, simple as they were, became symbolic. They represented transition, from community to solitude, from chaos to refuge, from public life to interior reflection. The threshold took on symbolic meaning across cultures, often associated with protection, belonging, or passage between worlds. Even the way people approached or knocked on an entrance signaled social hierarchy, intention, or respect. This new interiority extended beyond physical space. Once humans learned they could close a door, they began to close metaphorical ones as well. They developed internal boundaries, private thoughts, personal emotions, individual ambitions. The rise of privacy paralleled the rise of personhood. The group remained essential, but the individual began to emerge as a distinct entity with unique desires, fears, and dreams. This section concludes with the recognition that architecture did more than shape human settlements, it shaped human identity. The first walls created communities, but the first doors created individuals. Privacy allowed humans to become thinkers, creators, and dreamers in ways that communal life alone could not foster. The soft sound of a door closing echoed across generations, marking the moment when humanity discovered not only shelter from the world, but shelter within themselves. As villages grew and boundaries became clearer, the same structures that symbolized stability began to attract attention, from both allies and enemies. Food stores, fertile fields, and sturdy shelters represented survival, and survival had value. With value came competition. Early human groups, once small and scattered, now found themselves defending resources that had taken seasons to cultivate and years to refine. The very walls that offered protection from nature suddenly needed to protect against one another. Architecture, once a quiet tool of shelter and community, became a weapon in the landscape of early conflict. Imagine a village at dusk, its walls glowing warm in the fading sunlight. Smoke drifts gently from hearths, and families settle into their evening routines. But beyond the perimeter, hidden by tall grasses, another group watches. They see not a community, they see opportunity, grain to steal, livestock to claim, shelter to occupy. What was once a simple boundary now turns into a threshold between peace and violence. The wall's purpose shifts from shielding wind to withstanding intrusion. This transformation introduces a new tension into human life, the fear of attack. Before permanent settlements, conflict between groups was brief and sporadic. Nomadic peoples rarely fought over land because land could not be owned. But once walls marked territory, ownership became tangible. A village's granary or field was no longer part of the open world, it was a possession worth guarding. Disputes arose not only from hunger but from pride, boundaries, and rival claims. The architecture of settlement unintentionally created the architecture of war. Early defensive structures were simple: thicker walls, deeper posts, piles of stones stacked higher, thorny barriers placed along entry paths. But their psychological impact was immense. A fortified boundary signaled strength. It warned outsiders that entry required force, and force involved risk. This deterrence changed how groups interacted. Negotiation, trade, and alliances emerged partly because the consequence of breach had grown more severe. Even in their simplest forms, defensive walls shaped diplomacy. Inside the village, defense reshaped daily life. Watch points were added, raised platforms or sharpened stakes that gave lookouts higher vantage. The perimeter became a space of vigilance, not just structure. Young members of the community learned to patrol, to listen for threats, to read the signs of approaching danger. The wall was no longer just a passive boundary, it was an active part of survival strategy. Standing at its edge meant standing between loved ones and harm. Conflict also drove innovation. Villages experimented with new building materials, testing which combinations resisted impact or fire. Some reinforced their walls with packed earth or layers of stone. Others created double walls with narrow gaps where defenders could move unseen. Trenches, ditches, and raised earthworks appeared around settlements that anticipated attack. architecture began to mirror the evolving tactics of conflict. The more threats humans faced, the more sophisticated their constructions became. But these innovations came at a cost. As walls grew stronger, so did the sense of separation between groups. Trust became rarer. Cooperation between distant settlements waned, replaced by suspicion. People began to categorize others not just as strangers, but as potential invaders. Identity hardened around the boundaries of home. The emotional landscape of human life shifted, fear of outsiders became ingrained, and belonging grew increasingly tied to one's own walled community. Within the walls, this pressure sometimes strengthened unity. Shared danger forged deeper bonds. Families supported one another more fiercely, knowing they faced the same threats. Rituals might be held at the perimeter before planting or harvest seasons, asking ancestors or spirits for protection. The wall became a symbol not just of defense but of togetherness, a physical reminder of what the community stood to lose. Yet conflict also reshaped leadership. Those who understood strategy, negotiation, or construction gained influence. Decision-making grew more organized as communities developed councils or leaders responsible for security. Defensive architecture required coordination, labor, and planning. This complexity pushed societies toward more structured forms of governance. Architecture, war, and leadership became intertwined. Still, not every conflict left scars of violence. Sometimes rival groups approached a fortified village, saw its strength, and chose peace instead of battle. A strong wall could prevent war as effectively as it prepared for it. Defense acted as deterrence. In this paradox, architecture became both shield and signal, a message carved into the landscape that conveyed resilience without a single word. This section concludes with the understanding that the rise of defensive walls marked a profound change in the human story. Protection became defense, boundary became border, home became fortress. These developments shaped the trajectory of civilizations to come, empires, cities, nations. But at its root, the shift was deeply human, a response to fear, ambition, and the desire to preserve what mattered most. The threshold of early architecture became a battleground, and in defending it, humanity learned the high cost, and the high value, of stability. As architecture grew more ambitious, so did the effort required to bring it to life. Early constructions that once took a few hours, the leaning of branches, the stacking of stones, evolved into projects demanding weeks, months, or even years of collective labor. A single wall could no longer be raised by one pair of hands, it required many. The act of building became a shared responsibility, binding communities together through sweat, cooperation, and a common goal. Yet with this new scale came new challenges, questions of leadership, distribution of work, fairness, and the emotional weight carried by those who shaped the structures meant to protect their people. Picture an early farming village preparing to build a new storage structure. Grain yields have increased, predators have grown bolder, and the community decides to construct a granary larger and safer than any before. The decision is made during a gathering at dusk, where elders and experienced builders outline the plan. At first light, the entire village moves into action. Some gather timber from the forest. Others dig foundations, lifting soil that will soon support walls thicker than anything they've built. Children carry smaller loads, stones, reeds, tools, proud to be part of the effort. The air fills with a sense of purpose, and yet beneath it lies an unspoken truth: building such structures is exhausting, demanding, and often dangerous. The physical burden placed on builders was immense. Stones were heavy, timber unwieldy, and mud had to be collected, mixed, and shaped in large quantities. Injuries were common: crushed fingers, strained backs, falls from heights that only a few generations earlier humans would never have climbed. Weather could turn a day's progress into a muddy ruin or a collapsed section of wall. Builders had to endure heat, wind, and long hours, all without tools beyond the simplest forms of leverage and support. In this struggle, architecture became a test not just of innovation, but of endurance. Because construction required coordination, leadership naturally emerged. Those with a sharper eye for stability, those who understood how materials behaved, those who could envision the final structure, they became guides, foremen, architects in the earliest sense. Their voices carried weight during planning, and their decisions influenced the safety and success of the entire village. But leadership came with its own burden, responsibility. If a wall collapsed, if a roof leaked, if a structure failed under stress, the blame fell heavily on those who had directed the work. Leadership in early architecture demanded humility, resilience, and a willingness to learn from every mistake. These projects also revealed the social dynamics of the community. Not everyone contributed in the same way, and not everyone felt the burden equally. Some individuals were physically stronger, others possessed knowledge passed down through generations. Some felt pride in building, while others felt fatigue or resentment. Yet all were tied to the outcome. A poorly built structure endangered the entire group, so even reluctant participants found themselves drawn into the effort. This shared labor reinforced unity. Each stone placed became a thread tying individuals to something greater than themselves. Over time, skills sharpened. A builder who mastered the art of mixing the strongest clay became valued. Another who knew how to position posts without them splitting was respected. Expertise became a form of identity. People began to specialize, not because society demanded it, but because the work itself revealed natural talents. These early craftsmen and craftswomen carried the legacy of every structure they helped raise. They taught their knowledge to apprentices, often their own children, ensuring that each generation built better than the one before. Emotionally, building was more than labor, it was an act of hope. Every wall raised symbolized a belief in the future. Every roof completed represented the promise of shelter for winters yet to come. The builders carried this emotional weight quietly. They worked not for themselves alone but for children they had not yet met, for elders who relied on strong walls, for the continuity of their community. In this way, architecture became a form of storytelling, one told not through words, but through structures left standing for generations. But the burden also brought conflict at times. Disagreements over where to build, how to prioritize labor, or which materials to use could fracture relationships. When resources were scarce, debates over distribution grew intense. Should the best materials go to the grain store or the home of the family expecting a newborn? Should efforts focus on defense or expansion? These questions revealed the deeper complexities of communal life. Architecture forced humans to confront choices about values, priorities, and fairness. Yet even through conflict, building unified. There was nothing quite like the moment when a structure was completed, when the final stone was placed, when the last beam settled into position, when the entire village stepped back to see what they had created. Pride swelled in those moments. Exhaustion softened into satisfaction. Children danced around the new building, elders placed their hands on the walls, testing their strength with quiet approval. The builder's burden became a shared triumph. This section ends with the recognition that architecture is not only the story of structures, but the story of the people who built them, their labor, their sacrifices, their learning, their leadership. Every stone laid in ancient times carried not just weight, but intention. Every wall bore the imprints of hands that shaped it. Through building, early humans learned one of their most enduring lessons, that the act of creating something for others is a legacy far stronger than any single lifespan. Once early humans mastered the art of building sturdy shelters and defensive walls, a new possibility emerged, one that would forever reshape how people lived, thought, and interacted. Instead of a single open space shared by an entire family or community, homes and structures began to divide into multiple rooms. These divisions were not merely architectural, they were psychological and social revolutions. A world that had once been entirely open transformed into a landscape of interior complexity. Rooms created zones of purpose, privacy, identity, and imagination. With each new wall built inside a structure, humanity entered a deeper relationship with space itself. Picture an early home at dawn. A low fire still glows in the central hearth, casting soft light on walls smoothed with mud and reinforced with reed mats. For the first time, this home is divided into distinct areas, one for sleeping, another for cooking, another for storing food or tools. These separations may be simple, partial walls, woven partitions, elevated platforms, but their impact is profound. The family wakes in a designated resting area, steps into a working area, and organizes daily life with a rhythm defined by boundaries. A room is not just a physical space, it is an idea given structure. The creation of rooms changed how people understood function. Previously, activities overlapped in shared spaces, cooking next to sleeping, crafting next to storytelling, firelight touching every corner. Now, rooms encouraged specialization. A storage room kept food dry and protected. A workspace allowed tools to be shaped without disrupting rest. A sleeping area minimized noise and offered warmth. These divisions optimized daily life, giving households an efficiency and stability that nomadic shelters could never achieve. For the first time, architecture actively supported human routines instead of merely containing them. Rooms also deepened the emotional experience of home. A child's corner became a familiar refuge, shaped by toys made of bone or wood. A couple could retreat to a more secluded area to talk or rest without being overheard. Elders might have a dedicated place to sit, reflect, or pass down stories. These designated spaces created rituals, habits, and memories tied to specific environments. Walls no longer served only structural purposes, they guided behavior, shaped identity, and held meaning. With multiple rooms, homes became symbolic maps of family life. The placement of a hearth spoke to the centrality of warmth and community. The position of storage spaces indicated the importance of food and survival. The location of sleeping quarters reflected beliefs about protection and intimacy. Every choice made during construction translated into a philosophy of living. Architecture, even at this early stage, began mirroring the psychological architecture of human existence. The emergence of interior complexity also paved the way for social hierarchy. As some families accumulated more resources or grew in influence, their homes expanded not just outward, but inward. Larger households developed specialized rooms, areas for weaving, grinding grain, crafting weapons, or caring for infants. Visitors entering such homes could immediately see signs of status reflected in the number and quality of rooms. Space became a marker of prestige. The more complex the home, the more respected its inhabitants became. Thus, architecture began shaping social dynamics in subtle but powerful ways. These internal divisions influenced community interactions as well. When homes had designated spaces for receiving guests, hospitality became a ritualized part of daily life. When certain rooms were off-limits to outsiders, boundaries of trust and respect grew clearer. The distinction between public and private expanded beyond the individual home to the entire settlement. Whole villages began organizing themselves around shared spaces, meeting areas, communal ovens, water storage, and clusters of homes with varied internal structures. Complexity spread outward from the individual room to the community as a whole. But with complexity came new challenges. Rooms required more maintenance, more materials to repair cracks, more surfaces susceptible to weather, more corners where pests might hide. Builders had to refine their techniques, using sturdier supports and more durable mixtures of mud or clay. Ventilation became important. Smoke from indoor fires needed to escape without letting in rain. Light had to be managed, with small openings carved into walls or roofs. These challenges sparked innovation, driving early architecture toward experimentation and improvement. The emotional impact of rooms cannot be overstated. They changed how people understood the self. Having a designated space encouraged introspection, creativity, and personal ownership. A room was a place where thoughts could settle, where tasks could be completed without interruption, where a person could express a small piece of who they were. Over generations, this nurtured individuality and artistic expression. Walls became canvases for painted patterns. Floors were smoothed with care. Decorative items, stones, feathers, crafted objects, filled corners, turning rooms into reflections of personal taste. This section concludes by recognizing that the invention of the room was not a simple architectural step, it was a cognitive leap. By dividing space, humans divided experience. By shaping structure, they shaped identity. By building rooms, they built societies capable of complexity, specialization, and emotional depth. The world outside remained vast and wild, but inside, humanity crafted microcosms of order, meaning, and imagination. Rooms were not just spaces, they were milestones in the unfolding story of human civilization. Long before the rise of grand civilizations, before Mesopotamia, Egypt, or the Indus Valley, there were places where humans experimented with forms of settlement so ambitious, so intricate, and so symbolically rich that they resembled proto-cities. These early sites did not yet have kings or written laws, but they possessed something just as transformative, a deliberate shaping of space on a scale far beyond the needs of mere survival. They were monumental experiments, giant leaps forward where communities built with vision and purpose, revealing the early genius of human architecture. Imagine standing atop a rise overlooking Catalhoyuk during its height. Homes cluster together in dense layers, their rooftops forming a continuous landscape of clay and plaster. There are no streets, people move across flat roofs, climbing through openings in the ceiling to enter their dwellings below. Smoke rises in thin lines from hundreds of hearths. From a distance, the settlement looks like a living organism, cells packed tightly, beating with the rhythm of daily life. This is not a simple village. It is a complex, interconnected world, built intentionally to support thousands. The creators of Catalhoyuk crafted walls with remarkable precision. Interiors were decorated with murals, handprints, hunting scenes, geometric patterns. Burials were placed beneath floors, connecting family life with ancestral memory. Storage rooms held grain and meat, reflecting advanced food management. Each home, while similar in structure, carried subtle variations that expressed the identity of the family within. The entire settlement was a radical experiment in density and unity. It foreshadowed the future, communities that relied not on open land, but on architecture to support ever-growing populations. Jericho, even older, presents a different but equally astonishing vision. Perched near a valuable water source, it rose as one of the first fortified settlements in human history. Thick stone walls encircled the community, towering far above what was necessary to keep out animals. A monumental tower, nearly 9 meters high, stood within these walls, its interior accessed by a stone staircase spiraling upward. No one knows exactly why it was built. Protection? Ritual? Status? Whatever the purpose, its existence reveals that early humans were not just building to survive, they were building to express power, identity, and collective meaning. Göbekli Tepe pushes the boundary even further, predating both agriculture and permanent villages in some interpretations. Massive T-shaped stone pillars, carved with intricate images of animals, stand arranged in circles. These structures required thousands of hours of labor, transporting and shaping stones far heavier than any practical shelter needed. There is no evidence that people lived at Göbekli Tepe. Instead, it appears to have been a ceremonial site, a gathering place of breathtaking scale. Here, architecture served not the stomach, but the spirit. It demonstrated that humans could coordinate monumental projects long before cities, or even settled farming societies, existed. These early sites share a common theme: imagination unbound by immediate necessity. The builders were experimenting with how far they could push architecture. They tested new methods of construction, new forms of social organization, and new ways of defining community. Walls became thicker, structures larger, and spatial planning more deliberate. In each place, we see the spark of what would one day ignite into urban civilization. But these monumental experiments came with challenges. Supporting large populations required coordination on a scale never before attempted. Food storage systems had to be efficient and secure. Waste had to be managed. Space had to be divided and negotiated. Resources needed to be gathered from surrounding lands in sustainable ways. These demands encouraged new forms of leadership, specialization, and cooperation. Architects, builders, artists, and craftsmen began to emerge as distinct roles. Society became more layered, more organized, more complex. Movement within these proto-cities also reshaped daily life. The absence of streets in Catalhoyuk forced people into rooftop circulation, creating an elevated world that blurred lines between public and private. The towering walls of Jericho signaled collective identity and shared effort, monuments that united people under a common protective boundary. The ceremonial enclosures of Göbekli Tepe invited gathering, storytelling, and ritual on an unprecedented scale, fostering spiritual and cultural cohesion. Architecture, for the first time, was shaping not just the place people lived, but the way they lived. Emotionally, these spaces carried immense power. The climb up Jericho's tower may have invoked awe or humility. Entering a stone circle at Göbekli Tepe might have stirred reverence and wonder. Walking across the rooftops of Catalhoyuk, hearing footsteps echo above, below, and beside, created a sensation of constant connection. These sensations mattered. They influenced behavior, belief, and identity in ways simple shelters never could. This section concludes with the realization that these early monumental sites were more than settlements. They were the first human attempts to craft complex worlds. They represent the origins of cities not in size alone, but in intention, the desire to build places where life could flourish together, where meaning could be shared, and where human potential could be expanded through architecture. These experiments laid the foundations for the cities that would follow, cities that would redefine the future of humanity. Even the strongest walls, the most carefully planned enclosures, and the most hopeful villages were never guaranteed to endure. Nature, conflict, and time tested every human creation, and many of the earliest structures eventually fell, not quietly, but dramatically. Collapse, fire, flood, and abandonment scarred the ancient world, reminding early humans that permanence was an illusion. These failures carried lessons as valuable as any successful construction. Each fallen wall was both a tragedy and a teacher. Imagine a thriving settlement built near a river, its granaries full, its homes sturdy, its people confident in the security their walls provide. Over several seasons, the river swells higher than expected. Heavy rains feed the current until it becomes a roaring force. One night, when the villagers sleep, the riverbank gives way. Water surges into the settlement, turning packed earth floors into mud, toppling walls softened by moisture, sweeping away tools, food, and memories. By dawn, the village stands half destroyed, its people devastated not just by loss of shelter but by the realization that nature's power cannot be fully tamed. Such catastrophes were common in early human history. Fire, especially, was an ever-present danger. A single spark from a hearth could leap onto a dry roof, spreading quickly across tightly clustered homes. Mud walls baked hard by the sun could crack under sudden heat, causing sections of structures to collapse inward. A settlement that took years to build could be consumed in minutes. The smell of smoke, the roar of flames, the cries of families trying to save what little they could, these moments etched themselves deeply into the collective memory of early communities. Structural failure brought its own dangers. If a wall cracked at the base, if mud was not mixed properly, if stones were not balanced with care, entire portions of a dwelling could collapse without warning. Injuries, even fatalities, were common. Builders learned harsh lessons, where foundations must be stronger, which materials withstand weather, how to angle supports against wind. Failure refined architectural knowledge in ways success never could. Every fallen wall became a record of what not to repeat. Abandonment was another kind of collapse, silent, slow, and often heartbreaking. Sometimes soil lost its fertility, forcing farmers to leave behind homes they had poured years of labor into. Other times rivers changed course, or game migrated elsewhere, or illness spread through a settlement, weakening its population until families simply walked away. The walls they left behind slowly crumbled into dust. Roofs sagged, beams decayed, floors filled with drifting soil. Over time, nature reclaimed the space, plants sprouted through cracks, insects nested in corners, roots wound their way around stones. A village that once vibrated with life became a ghost of its former self. Animal intrusion also contributed to structural failure. Termites hollowed wooden posts from within. Burrowing creatures undermined foundations. Larger predators seeking warmth or shelter might push through weakened barriers. In some collapses, the line between human settlement and wilderness dissolved in a matter of days. Early communities learned the hard way that building was not a single act, but a constant battle against forces seen and unseen. Yet every failure held meaning. When a settlement was destroyed, survivors rebuilt, with stronger materials, deeper foundations, wider drainage channels, more fire-resistant designs. They adapted their architecture to the environment's demands, realizing that resilience required not just strength but understanding. A collapsed roof taught the importance of angle and support. A flooded home taught the necessity of elevation. A burned granary taught the need for distance between hearths and storage. Human innovation flourished not in comfort, but in hardship. These failures also shaped social structures. After a disaster, communities often rallied together, sharing tools, distributing food, comforting those who lost loved ones. Reconstruction became a collective effort infused with shared grief and shared determination. Bonds strengthened. Leadership emerged from those who guided rebuilding. The memory of a collapse, though painful, bound communities in stories passed down through generations. This happened once before, here is how we survived. Emotionally, collapsed walls carried a weight that extended beyond practical loss. They symbolized vulnerability. They reminded early humans that no matter how strong their hands, no matter how clever their designs, they remained part of a world far greater and more powerful than themselves. This humility shaped spiritual beliefs, rituals, and the emotional landscapes of entire cultures. People created offerings for protection, carved symbols into walls, and sought meaning in the destruction as much as in creation. Yet abandoned and broken settlements were not failures in the larger story of humanity, they were stepping stones. Each forgotten dwelling, each cracked foundation, contributed to the evolution of architecture and society. The knowledge gained from collapse laid the groundwork for future stability. Ruins became teachers, whispering lessons to anyone who stopped to observe. This section ends with a quiet truth: walls fail, but ideas endure. Every fallen structure fed the next innovation. Every destroyed village prepared the next generation to build wiser, stronger, and more resilient spaces. In the shadows of forgotten walls lies the very foundation of the architectural triumphs yet to come. Long after ancient settlements collapsed, long after their walls fell silent and their fires cooled to ash, the earth preserved their stories in layers of soil, stone, and bone. Archaeologists, part detectives, part historians, part storytellers, carefully brush away this dust to reveal fragments of the past, each discovery a window into the minds and hearts of early humans. These remnants are not just artifacts, they are echoes of decisions, emotions, and dreams. Through them, we learn not only how our ancestors lived, but what they valued, feared, and aspired to become. Imagine kneeling beside an excavation site at sunrise. The air is still cool, the ground soft with dew, and before you lies the faint outline of an ancient dwelling. A charred patch of earth marks where a hearth once burned. A cluster of broken tools lies near the entrance, perhaps dropped in haste during a crisis or simply abandoned when the inhabitants moved on. Bits of pottery, cracked and faded, hint at meals shared or rituals performed. Even the soil color, darkened in some places, lighter in others, whispers secrets about life long gone. Archaeologists read these details like a language carved not in stone, but in time. The placement of walls tells us how people understood space. A narrow corridor might suggest privacy, an open room hints at communal gatherings. Thick foundations indicate a desire for stability, perhaps after past collapses. A series of small partitions reveals an expansion of family structure or the emergence of specialized work areas. In this way, architecture becomes a form of memory, storing traces of human evolution in the very way homes were shaped. Even debris speaks. Piles of animal bones reveal dietary habits and hunting techniques. Charcoal remnants indicate what kinds of wood were burned, how fires were controlled, and how often they were relit. Tools found near specific corners of homes show where people forged, shaped, or crafted materials. Each small detail builds a mosaic of everyday life, showing not just major events, but the quiet routines that sustained communities. One of the most powerful lessons archaeology teaches is that early humans were not crude, simplistic beings. They were inventive, emotional, and deeply connected to their environment. They experimented constantly. When a building technique failed, they tried another. When a resource ran scarce, they adapted their diet or tools. When a settlement grew, they reorganized spaces. Archaeological layers reveal these adaptations like chapters in a book, each stratum showing a new response to the changing world. We also learn that communities were resilient. Burned structures often contain signs of rebuilding, new floors laid over charred ones, thicker walls replacing collapsed ones, expanded rooms where smaller ones once stood. These layers show determination, hope, and an unending desire to improve life for the next generation. Ruins are not marks of failure, they are footprints of progress. Beyond practicalities, archaeology reveals the emotional world of early humans. Burials inside homes show how people honored their dead and kept them close. Decorations on walls or pottery indicate aesthetic sensibilities and symbolic thinking. Carefully placed stones or carved objects appear to mark sacred spaces, showing that humans sought meaning far beyond survival. Even where patterns on floors, lighter in areas where people walked frequently, darker where they sat or slept, preserve intimate glimpses of daily rhythms. Archaeological findings also remind us that humanity's journey has always been interconnected. Similar building techniques appear across distant regions, suggesting early forms of knowledge exchange or parallel innovation. Decorative motifs echo across thousands of miles, hinting at shared beliefs or migratory connections. No settlement existed in isolation, every community contributed to a shared human story. But perhaps the most profound lesson lies in the fragility of human creations. Even the strongest walls eventually fall, and the most vibrant villages fade into soil. Archaeology teaches humility. It shows us that the things we construct, no matter how grand, will one day become dust. Yet within that dust lies continuity. The traces left behind shape our understanding of who we are today. This realization transforms ruins into teachers. They teach patience, as excavation requires careful precision. They teach empathy, as we imagine lives lived under different skies. They teach perspective, reminding us that humanity has faced hardship repeatedly and persevered through every era. And they teach gratitude, as each discovery brings us closer to understanding our shared origins. This section closes by emphasizing that the dust of ancient settlements is not silence, it is a conversation across time. Through archaeology, we listen to the voices of those who lived before us. They speak through stones arranged with intention, through ashes that once warmed a family, through tools shaped by hands long gone. Their lessons, preserved in earth, guide us forward, reminding us that our present is built upon their dreams, their labor, and their unspoken wisdom. The story of humanity's first architect does not end with their final breath, nor with the last wall they shaped by hand. In truth, it begins there, because the structures they left behind, the ideas they sparked, and the possibilities they revealed continued to ripple through time long after their body returned to the soil. This section explores that legacy in depth, not just the physical inheritance of early architecture, but the emotional, social, and philosophical imprint left by a single human who dared to imagine a different way of living. Over centuries, this imprint evolved, spread, transformed, and ultimately became a foundation upon which entire civilizations would rise. The first architect did not witness the full impact of their creation. They could not have known how far the echoes would travel. But through the traces they left, we can follow the journey of an idea, moving from one mind to many, from one shelter to countless cities, shaping human destiny through layers of time. Imagine the architect in their final years. The village they helped shape has grown. New homes stand where open fields once stretched. Children play atop sturdy walls that would have collapsed in storms long ago, had their builder not understood the need for thicker clay, deeper foundations, better support beams. Families sleep each night beneath roofs designed using techniques this architect refined through years of trial and error. And yet, as the architect watches life flow around them, they understand something deeper: the village is no longer dependent on their hands alone. Others have learned the craft. Others have taken their early sketches in the dirt and transformed them into improved forms. The idea has become communal. What began as one person's vision now belongs to everyone. Knowledge, in this moment, becomes the architect's true legacy. They pass down stories, demonstrating how to brace a wall against seasonal winds, how to mix mud so it dries without cracking, how to arrange stones so weight distributes evenly. These lessons embed themselves into the village's memory, shaping how future generations will build long after the original builder is gone. Children who once watched the architect work now teach their own children the same movements, the same principles, each gesture refined by time. Through these actions, the architect becomes more than a person, they become a foundation stone in the lineage of human knowledge. As decades pass, the settlement expands. New families arrive, drawn by the stability of permanent structures and the promise of shared labor. They bring with them their own ideas, small adjustments, improvements inspired by distant experiences. Perhaps one traveler suggests using reeds in the plaster for added strength. Another may have seen a different style of entrance in a faraway camp and proposes adopting it here. Innovation grows in layers. The architect's original teachings remain the core, but new insights branch outward, creating a system of architecture richer than any single mind could produce. This is how knowledge evolves, through sharing, adaptation, and collective creativity. But the legacy of the first architect is not merely technical. It is emotional. Their work teaches the village what it means to trust in human effort, not just nature's generosity. Before the architect's innovations, the community depended on finding shelter rather than making it. A safe night's sleep was a gift, not a guarantee. But now, people believe in the power of their own hands to shape security. They believe in permanence, not absolute, but intentional. This shift transforms how they see themselves. Instead of being victims of weather, predators, or chance, they become agents capable of crafting solutions. The architect gives them not just structures, but confidence. This new sense of agency influences their worldview. As children grow up seeing carved posts and smooth walls around them, they internalize the idea that humans can change the environment. They watch their parents repair structures after storms and learn that damage is not the end, but the beginning of renewal. They see the village flourish, expand, and evolve. They hear stories about a time before walls, when life was unpredictable and movement endless. And each story reinforces their gratitude for the visionary who first taught them how to build. In this gratitude, they develop a new form of respect, not just for the past, but for the act of creation itself. The architect's death is mourned deeply. They are buried with rituals reserved for those whose lives shaped the course of the community. Perhaps their tools are placed beside them, a smooth stone used for mixing plaster, a wooden stake that once traced lines in the earth. Perhaps their favorite wall, the first one that stood firm against a storm, becomes a place where offerings are left for generations. Stories about them evolve into legends. Over time, these legends blend truth with imagination, transforming the architect into a mythic figure in the collective memory of the village. Yet myths, while powerful, are not the true measure of their legacy. The real measure lies in how their idea, the idea that humans can shape space, continues to evolve. The settlement grows into a cluster of structured homes. The cluster grows into a proto-village. The proto-village becomes a hub of activity along a migration path. People begin marking seasons by agricultural cycles rather than wandering patterns. They create rituals tied to planting and harvesting. They construct communal granaries, public gathering places, and, eventually, sacred enclosures. Each structure is a descendant of that first intentional wall. Over generations, the village becomes a place known to distant groups, a landmark of stability in a landscape where most communities still move with the seasons. Travelers come seeking knowledge, alliances, or safety. When they return to their own lands, they bring stories of the village's strong walls and well-organized homes. Inspired, they attempt similar experimentation. They build their first storage rooms, their first permanent shelters. Some fail, some crack, some collapse. But success spreads as surely as any rumor. Architecture propagates through human networks like seeds carried by wind. Centuries pass. The original settlement may grow or shrink or eventually fall to environmental changes. Yet its influence survives in the structures built by its descendants. One group migrates to a fertile valley and constructs their own village using the techniques their ancestors learned. Another group settles near a hill and builds defensive walls that mimic the ones they heard about through stories. Each new settlement becomes a node in the ever-expanding web of architectural knowledge. Even if the original architect's name fades, their impact does not. It takes root in cultural patterns, in shared techniques, in the very notion that homes should be built rather than borrowed from nature. In time, some communities develop new methods that surpass the architect's original designs. They experiment with stone instead of mud, discovering its durability. They create multi-room homes, structured pathways, and carefully planned village layouts. When population grows too large, some communities build outward, others build upward, layering dwellings like stacked chambers. The first architect would not recognize these evolved forms, yet they are all extensions of the same foundational idea. As hundreds, then thousands of years pass, architecture becomes intertwined with identity, power, and spirituality. Temples rise, carved from stone that takes decades to shape. Fortresses stand on hills, watching over fertile valleys. New builders, with knowledge inherited from generations of ancestors, push boundaries further. They create monumental structures that dwarf the simple walls of early settlements. Yet deep within the philosophy of every massive structure lies the whisper of that first insight: humans can build their own spaces. It is here that the first architect's legacy becomes universal. Their idea becomes inseparable from human civilization itself. Every city that rises, every home constructed, every protective wall built against invaders or storms owes a faint debt to the person who first dared to mix mud differently, who first stacked stones with intention, who first asked whether a shelter could outlive a single night. Imagine now a modern archaeologist uncovering the remains of that original settlement. They kneel in the dust, brushing away layers to reveal the faint outlines of ancient walls. Each line in the earth tells a story, of people who lived, laughed, struggled, and innovated. The archaeologist may never know the name of the first architect. That name has likely been lost to time. But the evidence of their thought process survives in the arrangement of stones, in the thickness of walls, in the patterns that show intentional shaping of space. As the archaeologist studies these remains, a realization dawns: the structure beneath their hands is not simply a ruin. It is the birthplace of human transformation. A turning point where instinct evolved into mastery, where survival evolved into creativity, where humans took the first step toward becoming the builders of the world. This is the architect's true legacy, not a monument carved in stone, not a title passed through bloodline, but a shift in how humanity understood itself. They gifted the world an idea that would outlive them by millennia, the belief that space could be shaped, meaning could be built, and the world could be transformed by human vision. In this way, the first architect becomes immortal. Every room, every wall, every city is a distant echo of their first attempt. The arc of human civilization bends through their contribution like light through a prism. And though they lived in a world of harsh weather, scarce resources, and constant uncertainty, their work expanded the horizon of what humans believed possible. This section closes with the understanding that legacy is not measured in fame or monuments, but in the endurance of an idea. The first architects' hands shaped mud, but their mind shaped the future. They carved a path forward for all of humanity, proving that the human spirit does not merely adapt to the world, it transforms it. Their gift was not a wall, but a worldview. And through that worldview, their presence resonates across ages, alive in every structure touched by human imagination. We stand today in a world shaped by walls so commonplace, so intimately woven into the rhythm of our lives, that their origins often go unnoticed. Walls separate our rooms, define our homes, outline our cities, and mark the limits of nations. They surround our memories, protect our families, and enclose our dreams. But if we trace these boundaries far enough back through time, beyond concrete, beyond brick, beyond the carved stones of ancient cities, we arrive at a moment when walls were not yet part of the human experience. A moment when our ancestors lived exposed to the open world, guided only by instinct, movement, and the cycles of nature. Section 21 examines how, from those early beginnings, walls have evolved into the defining architecture of human civilization, and what they reveal about us today. Imagine standing at the edge of a modern city, watching its skyline stretch toward the horizon. Buildings rise like forests of steel and glass, each one a cluster of walls forming offices, bedrooms, classrooms, and countless other spaces. Roads weave between them like arteries. Distant neighborhoods cluster behind fences and hedges. Even in open parks, benches and paths subtly guide movement, offering unspoken cues about where one can walk, sit, or gather. This structured world feels natural to us, but its order is the result of thousands of years of experimentation, of walls gradually shaping not only physical landscapes but human behavior itself. From the first intentional boundary drawn in prehistoric soil, humans entered a new relationship with space. We stopped merely inhabiting the world and began defining it. Walls became tools through which we took control of uncertainty. They set limits, created safety, and allowed for planning. The rise of architecture marked the beginning of a mental shift. Survival was no longer exclusively a reaction to nature's demands, it became a strategic shaping of environment. Today, that shift permeates every aspect of human life. The analytical importance of walls in modern society begins with their role in stability. Early humanity faced unpredictability, weather, predators, hunger. Walls mitigated those threats by carving out pockets of controlled space. In present times, the threats have changed: crime, pollution, noise, privacy concerns, but the solution remains remarkably similar. Families build fences to feel safer in their yards. Cities erect flood barriers to withstand rising waters. Nations build border walls, controversial, complex structures reflecting both fear and political ambition. The instinct to protect is not new, it is ancient. Walls reveal our desire to create order in a world that still holds elements of chaos. But even as walls provide protection, they also reveal our limitations. Throughout history, every wall has represented both inclusion and exclusion, who is allowed inside, and who must remain outside. This dual function began in early villages, where walls defined shared space for community members and distinguished them from outsiders. Today, this continues on a global scale. The dividing lines between neighborhoods, economic zones, and nations often depend on physical or symbolic walls. These boundaries can strengthen identity, but they can also harden divisions. To understand this duality, we look back to those early architectural experiments. The first walls protected families from predators but also shut out neighboring groups who might have been allies. In the same way, modern walls protect resources and home spaces but also raise questions of access, inequality, and social distance. The deeper analytical insight is that walls reflect human psychology as much as engineering. They embody our needs, fears, aspirations, and values. The stronger our desire for security, the taller our walls become. The stronger our desire for community, the more we shape those walls to invite connection rather than isolation. Beyond protection and separation, walls also enable complexity. Without boundaries, differentiation becomes difficult. Early architecture revealed that separating space into rooms, homes, storage areas, schools, workplaces, created the foundation for organization. Today's world would be impossible without such divisions. Hospitals require sterile rooms. Libraries need quiet areas. Laboratories demand controlled environments. Homes separate kitchen from bedroom for functional and sanitary reasons. This organizational clarity is one of the hallmarks of wall-based architecture, enabling societies to grow in sophistication. From an anthropological perspective, this shift toward complexity parallels the rise of social structures. Once humans had walls, they could store food safely, ensuring reliable nutrition. Reliable nutrition allowed population growth. Population growth required governance, planning, and coordination. Architecture influenced society as much as society influenced architecture. When we look at modern cities, with their zoning laws, infrastructure systems, and layered communities, we see the culmination of that long process, an example of how walls allowed humans to transition from ephemeral existence to sustained civilization. Yet walls also play a subtle emotional role. Even today, many people feel uneasy in wide-open, boundless environments, an echo of ancestral vulnerability. We prefer enclosed rooms at night, we sleep better in confined spaces where threats feel distant or controlled. Children build forts because the small enclosure creates a sense of safety. Adults choose homes based on how secure the walls feel, how soundproof, how sturdy. This emotional connection to walls is not learned but inherited, a deep psychological imprint shaped over tens of thousands of years. But today, our world faces new questions about walls, questions far different from those of our earliest ancestors. In an age of globalization, digital communication, and interconnected economies, the meaning of boundary is changing. We now inhabit spaces that transcend physical walls, virtual communities, online classrooms, shared databases, and digital friendships. These spaces have no physical architecture, yet they still possess boundaries, user permissions, passwords, access controls. Once again, humanity is building walls, but this time out of code instead of stone or clay. And once again, those boundaries reflect both our desire for connection and our need for protection. The challenge of our era lies in balancing the benefits of boundaries with the dangers of isolation. As history has shown repeatedly, walls that protect can also restrict. A village wall defended against predators but could trap people during fire or flood. A city wall protected residents from attack but sometimes stifled commerce and progress. Today, emotional and ideological walls, the unseen barriers between cultures, nations, and individuals, can hinder collaboration, empathy, and growth. The analytical lesson from early architecture is that boundaries must adapt to context. In some situations, walls must be strengthened, in others, they must be opened. Successful societies have always known when to do which. One of the most profound insights we gain from the study of early architecture is that walls are not static. They evolve with human needs. They reflect shifting values. The first walls were crude, shaped by necessity, later walls incorporated beauty, symbolism, and meaning. Modern walls, whether digital or physical, continue this evolution. As climate changes, cities build seawalls and green barriers. As technology advances, homes require new types of insulation and energy-efficient materials. Architecture remains a living dialogue between human intention and environmental reality. Looking forward, the story of walls is far from over. If anything, we stand at the brink of another architectural revolution. New materials, transparent concrete, carbon-negative bricks, flexible polymers, promise structures that behave like living organisms, adapting to weather or movement. Smart homes regulate light, temperature, and security autonomously. Cities experiment with vertical gardens, suspended walkways, and modular apartments. As technology continues to evolve, we will likely build boundaries that respond to us in ways our ancestors could never have imagined. Yet even in the face of innovation, the core meaning of walls remains tied to human identity. We build because we care. We construct boundaries because we envision futures worth protecting. We divide space because we need places for rest, for work, for learning, for community. The earliest architect lived in a world raw and unpredictable, but their choice to shape the land was an act of hope, a declaration that humans could create stability where none existed. Today, every home, every school, every city carries forward that hope. Even the smallest wall built by human hands honors the ancient impulse to carve meaning out of chaos. And as we continue to build, we must remember that our walls reflect us, not just our skill, but our values. A society that builds only to isolate reveals fear, one that builds to protect and connect reveals wisdom. This section closes by stepping back to observe the arc of human history from its earliest shelters to its towering modern structures. In doing so, we see that walls are more than mere architecture, they are mirrors of the human condition. They show us who we were, who we are, and who we aim to become. The first wall marked the beginning of control over the environment. The walls of today mark the beginning of control over our own future. As we move into that future, the question we must ask is not simply what walls we will build, but why. Because the story of walls is ultimately the story of humanity itself, a journey of creativity, resilience, ambition, and identity. And long after today's buildings crumble into dust, just as ancient settlements once did, the idea behind them, our need to define, protect, and connect, will endure, guiding the generations yet to come. When we look across the vast sweep of human history, from the earliest footprints pressed into prehistoric soil to the glowing grids of modern cities visible from space, we begin to see a pattern emerge, one that unites every generation across tens of thousands of years. At the heart of this pattern lies a simple, profound truth: humans became human not only through adaptation, but through creation. We shaped the world as it shaped us. And one of the earliest, most transformative expressions of this creative impulse was the building of walls. Now, at the end of this documentary's journey, we step back to examine what this act truly meant, and what it still means, through the lens of our present era and the long horizon ahead. To understand the significance of the first wall, we must return to a world before boundaries. Picture the ancient landscape once more: infinite plains, shifting rivers, towering cliffs. People traversed these spaces without certainty. The earth asked much of them: endurance, ingenuity, cooperation, but it offered no promise of safety. In this volatile world, the earliest wall was not merely a physical object, it was a declaration of intention. It signaled that humans were no longer content to drift with the whims of nature. They would begin to anchor themselves. They would begin to shape time as well as space. This was not only a technological milestone, it was a cognitive revolution. Walls allowed humans to imagine a future worth preparing for. From permanence came planning, from planning came complex societies. To build a structure that could outlast a storm, a season, or even a lifetime was to assert a vision that reached beyond the immediate present. When we examine modern life, we find that nearly every aspect of civilization derives from this same impulse to create stability where none existed. Yet, as we reflect analytically on this journey, we see that walls have always served two purposes: to protect and to define. Early humans built them to keep predators out, but also to mark where community life began. Boundaries signaled belonging. They clarified social roles, organized activities, and shaped early cooperation. Today, we experience a similar duality. The walls of our homes protect us from weather and danger, but they also define spaces of intimacy, creativity, and rest. The walls of our institutions, schools, hospitals, libraries, organize our lives and reinforce roles essential to social functioning. Even the invisible boundaries that govern digital spaces echo ancestral instincts, creating zones of security and identity in an age where information travels faster than any ancient hunter could run. One of the most analytical insights revealed by studying early architecture is that walls are not inherently positive or negative. Rather, they reflect the values and fears of the people who build them. A boundary constructed for cooperation becomes a foundation for community. A boundary erected out of fear may calcify into division. This complexity has accompanied humanity from its earliest settlements to modern geopolitics. But what makes walls uniquely powerful is their neutrality. They become whatever we ask them to be. As we examine the arc of human progress, we find that walls have enabled some of our greatest innovations. Agriculture flourished behind protected fields. Trade networks expanded between stable settlements. Cities rose when populations could cluster without risking immediate collapse. Writing systems developed in forums and temples that endured across generations. Mathematics, science, philosophy, and art all emerged within the spaces walls created for sustained thought. Without defined boundaries, it is unlikely that the world's earliest civilizations could have taken root. But walls also reveal humanity's contradictions. They symbolize cooperation, yet they sometimes provoke conflict. They embody security, yet they can create isolation. This dual nature invites analytical reflection on how societies choose to use their boundaries. When early humans built their first defensive walls, they were responding to threats that endangered their survival. Over time, however, defensive architecture expanded into expressions of political power, military strategy, and territorial control. The evolution of walls mirrors the evolution of human complexity. As societies grew, so too did the meanings embedded within their structures. In today's world, the influence of ancient boundaries is still visible. The layout of a city, the division of land, the architecture of public spaces, all trace their origins to the earliest experiments with organizing human life. When we walk through a modern neighborhood, we are following pathways that descend from proto-villages. When we work in buildings with dozens of specialized rooms, we are echoing the logic of ancient multi-room homes. When nations negotiate borders, they are engaging in dialogue built upon the first territorial markers carved into prehistoric landscapes. Yet Section 22 asks us to go beyond these immediate parallels and consider the deeper implications. What do walls truly reveal about humanity's journey? What do they tell us about our present moment? And what might they signal about our future? One of the most important analytical observations is that walls highlight the human desire for control. They represent our effort to carve out a space where our influence is stronger than chance. Whether we build houses or hospitals, laboratories or schools, we are asserting the belief that human intention can prevail against randomness. This belief underpins scientific inquiry, technological advancement, and social organization. It is not the walls themselves that matter, it is the mindset they foster. But control has limits. Even the strongest walls cannot stop time, natural disasters, or shifting climates. Throughout history, human structures have collapsed under pressures they were never designed to withstand. These failures remind us that boundaries provide stability, not immortality. In the modern era, rising seas challenge coastal defenses. Extreme temperatures test the limits of traditional materials. Populations grow faster than cities can expand safely. These pressures force us to ask an ancient question in new ways: how do we build boundaries that adapt rather than merely resist? Future architecture may answer through innovation. Already, designers experiment with dynamic walls that flex under wind, buildings that adjust light automatically, cities designed as ecosystems rather than obstacles. The analytical perspective suggests that humanity is entering another architectural revolution, one that mirrors the shift from nomadic shelters to permanent settlements. Just as early humans invented walls to respond to new challenges, we too must rethink boundaries to meet the demands of a rapidly changing planet. Yet even as we look forward, the past offers valuable lessons. The most enduring structures in history were those built not solely for protection but for purpose. Temples, granaries, gathering halls, communal ovens, these structures survived because they served the shared needs of many. When architecture aligned with collective values, it became a force of cohesion rather than division. The same principle applies today: walls built in service of community strengthen society, walls built solely out of fear weaken it. As we move toward the documentary's final analytical reflections, we must also acknowledge that the meaning of walls has expanded beyond the physical. Digital boundaries shape how we interact online. Ethical boundaries guide scientific discovery. Psychological boundaries define personal well-being. In many ways, these invisible walls now influence our lives more than the concrete and brick surrounding us. Yet they follow the same ancient pattern: they protect, they organize, they define, and they evolve. When we compare the earliest shelters with modern skyscrapers, the differences appear enormous. But the continuity is striking. Both are responses to human vulnerability. Both attempt to turn uncertainty into stability. Both reflect the knowledge and values of their time. The skyscraper is no less a shelter than the mud-braced wall of an ancient village. It simply expresses a more complex relationship between humans and their environment. As we reach the conclusion of humanity's architectural journey, the long horizon comes into view. It stretches far beyond the first wall and far beyond the walls we live within today. That horizon invites a question at the heart of this final section: what does it ultimately mean to build a boundary? Analytically, it means recognizing the tension between connection and separation. Walls allow communities to flourish within defined spaces, but they also challenge us to consider what lies outside. They create shelter for those within, but they remind us of those who remain without. The key insight is that walls do not determine destiny, people do. We choose how to use them. We decide whether they become bridges or barriers, stages for collaboration or symbols of division. The earliest humans who built walls did not foresee modern cities, digital networks, or global societies. Yet their decision to shape space intentionally set the stage for all that followed. The first wall represents the moment when humanity began crafting its own stability. Every wall that followed, whether literal or metaphorical, has contributed to a long, unbroken chain of ideas linking past to present. In the final analytical reflection, we recognize that walls will continue to evolve as humanity evolves. They will rise, fall, shift, and transform as our needs change. But the core impulse behind them, the desire to create meaning, safety, and possibility, remains unchanged across time. This closing section, therefore, leaves us with a perspective shaped by thousands of years of architectural experimentation. Walls are not endpoints. They are beginnings. They mark the start of human intention, the foundation upon which we build futures, and the quiet reminder that every boundary we draw today will become history for someone tomorrow. As we look toward the long horizon, we carry with us the enduring truth learned at the dawn of human creativity, that to build is to believe in tomorrow, and that the walls we create, whether to shelter, to connect, to define, or to transform, are reflections of who we are and who we hope to become. And so, humanity continues, still constructing, still imagining, still shaping the world beyond the boundary of the first wall.